Urza Planeswalker is one of the greatest characters in fiction and is one of my all-time favorite heroes. Not because I like him per se, but because he's a very complicated character who has a pretty even balance of virtues and vices, all of which feel natural and they don't feel like they're tacked on. I find often when they're trying to make a character, particularly a hero, especially someone with immense abilities, not a Mary Sue, they just tack some random flaws on, which wound up making them even more of a Mary Sue. In Urza's case, though, he's an extremely flawed and exceedingly unlikable person, to be perfectly honest. People within the story, most people consider him to be a god. A lot of the people really hate him, and a lot of the things that he's trying to fix are things that he did. So it's kind of sad that Urza's not more well known and that he isn't really involved anymore in the Magic the Gathering story because of his death and because of the reboot. Because basically what happened was with Time Spiral, they had like a final hurrah to the old plotline. And then they just said, screw the plotline, we're going to just reboot the series. We're going to kill off all the remaining characters from the normal, the overarching plotline that like 90% of the series was. And we're going to bring in these like cool emo planeswalkers because kids will relate to that. Kids can't relate to people like Urza and Gerard. People can relate to emos like Jace Bellerin and goths like Liliana Vess. But for my part, Urza, as I've said, remains one of the most complex and fascinating characters in fiction. And I think a lot of people just look at MTG as a card game and they don't really look at the lore. I was always more interested in the lore than the card game. I certainly have a lot of the cards, but I really enjoyed the MTG books. Now, are they like super literature? No, they are pulpy. They are largely there to provide some background to the card game, but that doesn't mean it's not a good story, and that doesn't mean that it's not interesting. It also doesn't mean that it has no merit. It has a lot of merit, at least in my view. So, without more rambling, let's get into the story of Urza Planeswalker. So, Urza was born on Dominaria, the main plane that's at the center of the universe in Magic the Gathering, or henceforth just referred to as MTG. The Dominaria, I believe, is the largest plane. That's at least in my head canon, just to make sense of the fact that it's just when they refer to how important it is in relation to other planes, I get the impression it's much larger. And some other planes will only have a couple species, but Dominaria has like 7 continents or whatever and a whole bunch of different species. So, Urza was from a country called Argive. So, he was the elder of 2 brothers, Urza and Mishra. Urza was born on the first day of the year, and Mishra was born on the last day of the year, meaning on the last day of the year they would be equal, and that was kind of an ongoing theme throughout the books. So, Urza and Mishra were entrusted to a archaeologist named Tokasia. I'll just call her the archaeologist because I can't pronounce her name. But basically, if you haven't watched my video on Phyrexia, I'd recommend watching it. It'll give you some background to this. So the Thrawn were this ancient human race who had built the most advanced machinery that the multiverse had ever seen. And they had been wiped out during their war with Yawgmoth, etc. And most of their cities and stuff had been blasted to pieces, but a lot of it was still lying around in the desert. And Argive rose from kind of the ashes of the Thrawn, and people moved into the former Thrawn Empire, and they started digging through the desert. And it became a great center of learning throughout the continent. So Urza was apprenticed to a archaeologist, and he worked with them to look up stuff. And they made a number of important inventions and discoveries, one of which was the ornithopter, which is, well, if you've seen Dune, you know what an ornithopter is. It's kind of like a mechanical dragonfly. But it's around here we start to see Urza and Mishra. They're supposed to be opposites. Urza was born with white blonde hair, and Mishra was born with black hair. Urza is referred to as being decent looking, but Urza has severe autism, and I don't use that as a joke. He has very severe autism. Urza is completely incapable of interacting with other people and is completely uninterested in other people. And this is like a major plot point. It's not just like a character flaw that's viewed as quirky or anything. People actively despise him because of the way he treats people. Urza's only interested in machinery. He's only interested in knowledge and of building things. His brother, though, Mishra, was very personable. Mishra was able to charm people, to get them to like him. He was more interested in people than machines. That's not to say he wasn't a great artificer as well. But once we get into the Brothers' War, he used a lot more organic troops than Urza did. Urza, in general, if anything, disliked organics because he couldn't understand their emotions. So he would just spend all day, every day in his tent studying things. Whereas Mishra, his brother, would go out and talk to the men and make friends and that kind of thing. So basically, they just continued to dig through the desert, and they found the caves of Koilos, which is where Yawgmoth retreated through during the Phyrexian Thran War, and had been sealed shut by 2 Power Stones. The Power Stones, I believe, were made from the spark of a Planeswalker. I forget exactly. But Urza and Mishra find the 2 Power Stones, and they quickly discover that the 2 Power Stones were once part of a greater Power Stone, the most powerful Power Stone ever created. So Urza has the Might Stone, and Mishra has the Weak Stone. Urza's stone can make things stronger, mainly machines, and Mishra's stone can make things weaker, be it organic or machine. And the brothers begin to fight because Urza believes that the 2 stones should be reunited, and Mishra does as well, but but neither of them will have it united under the other. So they have a falling out, and during the falling out, they kill the archaeologist. Mishra runs away to live with a group of nomads, and Urza goes to Yoshia to continue to learn about stuff. So he works as an apprentice to a clockmaker named Rusko, and he's extremely talented at it. He quickly becomes a lot more knowledgeable than Rusko does. He is, though, once he still has no ability to interact with other people. Urza is also, I'm not sure if he's an atheist per se or just completely uninterested in religion. Rusko tries to explain, which it kind of becomes one of the great themes of Urza's life. In their society, they believe that a man has multiple souls throughout his life, and every time he undergoes a fundamental change, he gains a new soul. And when you die, the various souls are judged separately, which is kind of an interesting concept, and it really applies to Urza because he goes through completely different periods of his life that are utterly separate from one another. So in Yoshia, the warlord of Yoshia plants a massive stone block in the middle of his courtyard. He put a giant jade statue, and he said, anyone who can move this is worthy to marry my daughter, who will become basically my heir because he didn't have a son. They also offered him a huge hoard of treasure. So Urza and his autism is completely uninterested in it. Rusko's like, this is so romantic. And Urza just is looking around. He's like, oh, she's really hot, I don't care. Fucking 3D women. And he sees the pile of treasure, and he doesn't care about the gold or jewels. He sees the Thrawn tome, which is a very rare, complete Thrawn artifact that is filled with blueprints for Thrawn artifacts. Like I said, it's completely intact. It's almost unheard of. And Urza's like, I gotta win this contest. So he builds the first Yoshin soldier, which is basically a giant walking robot. And he uses the Might Stone to make it work. And he picks up and moves the jade statue. And the warlord is like, I'm not going to marry my daughter to this autistic loser. But the daughter's like, I might as well marry Urza. He's not bad looking, and he may be an autist, but at least he's not like a caveman who's gonna abuse me. So they get married. Urza is just looking all over the place. He probably doesn't even notice the wedding. So night happens. Theoretically, they have sex. I can't really picture Urza being attracted to anybody. Actually, it's funny in Apocalypse when he mentions that he was married and had sex with a woman, everyone just completely disbelieves it, and they're like, dude, you're way too autistic for something like that to happen. So after his wife falls asleep, probably out of boredom, Urza gets out of bed and goes and starts reading the Thran tome. And his wife quickly becomes really frustrated because he'll never sleep with her, despite her being the most beautiful woman in the kingdom of Yosha. So Urza just begins acquiring the reins of power in the country. The warlord, or the king of Yosha, is happy because Urza's able to make ornithopters and Yoshin soldiers and all these other different war machines, and he gives them basically unlimited resources. And he kind of climbs higher and higher, and he just doesn't care because he's just an autist and he just wants to build stuff. It's said that Urza would not eat unless people would shove a loaf of bread into his hand while he was working, and it was said that they could put a loaf of sawdust and he would have eaten it and not noticed. That is how autistic he was. So that happened. He also got Towns to come work with him, who's also an artificer, but is a much better person. So Mishra went and befriended the Caliph, or the Khan of a group of desert nomads that he went off with. So there's a bunch of sneak attacks, double crossings, and a lot of nonsense that we won't go into. Basically, one of the things that happened was they had kind of a war going on between the two kingdoms, and they met for a peace agreement. And when they were meeting for the peace agreement, the warlord bombed Mishra's camp and ruined all attempt of the brothers to reconcile. Because if that hadn't have happened, they probably would have reconciled. There probably would have been peace, and everything that happened probably wouldn't have happened. And later on in his life, Urza will just obsessively thinks about the day where everything just went so wrong. So yeah, the brothers had a permanent falling out, although later Mishra would show up again to try and negotiate a peace deal, and he would have sex with Urza's sex-starved wife. And it's often, while Urza does apparently sleep with his wife a couple more times in the future, Urza has a son and eventually has a stream of descendants, and no one really knows if they're descended from Urza or Mishra. I guess to a certain extent they both come from the same bloodline, but the fact that Urza just didn't really care that much, I think, shows a lot. I forget in the book if it really I think it pissed him off a little bit, but not too much. So anyways, so the brothers' dick-waving contest over who's a better artificer, combined with the various kind of petty warlords and kings and their desire for power, just kept escalating the war, because the Khan and the nomads wanted to take all this territory, and the warlord of Yosha wanted to, and all the other kind of kingdoms who had their historical beefs to settle started backing one or the other. So eventually Urza was made Lord Protector of a league of mainly kind of the more urbanized, I guess, kind of civilized peoples. And it's another good example of autism, because what winds up happening is they give him a mitre being what the popes and bishops wear, and it has power stones in it. And he's like, he's smiling when they're giving it to him, and Towns, his apprentice, is like, oh, this is being given to you by your homeland. You're receiving the greatest honor your homeland could possibly bestow you. That's why you're happy. And Urza's like, no, there's power stones on it. I could build some stuff with this. So that happens, and the war just kind of continues on and on. And what's interesting about the Brothers' War is there's no clear, like, protagonist or good side in it. The books are pretty clear that even if Mishra is worse, Urza isn't better. Both sides don't really fight each other very much. They just spend all the time fortifying, digging up the land, building more and more machines, strip mining, etc. The whole continent basically gets devastated, and there's not that many times they actually face each other off. Eventually, they even invent something called an Armageddon clock, which is, I think, like a nuclear weapon, and they glass large portions of the continent. So it just kind of keeps going on, and there's just more and more military buildup, and pollution just gets worse and worse. And to Urza, it's all to a certain extent like a game, because this is just his opportunity to keep building stuff. Mishra, I think, is more interested in ruling the world, but Urza is just, I think, kind of enjoying it because of all the stuff, the cool things and pretty pictures he gets to make. So it turns out, though, that during this whole time, since they had opened the portal to Phyrexia when they took out the Power Stones, that the Phyrexians, a Phyrexian demon named Gix had come through, and he wound up completing Mishra and taking over Mishra's side of the war. And that basically, by the end of the war, Urza discovered that his brother had died a long time ago. So they meet in a showdown off the coast at Argoth, which is a green mana island that's full of elves and druids and that kind of thing. And it's really the last source of resources left. And whatever side is able to gain control of it will get enough resources that they can... So Urza tried to bargain with them and said, look, if we can devastate half of your island, we can beat Mishra, as opposed to Mishra, who will devastate your entire island. And the druids and elves were like, that doesn't sound like a really good deal, Urza. So both sides attack the elves and manage to slaughter them. And then Mishra and Urza finally start to duke it out. And as 10 years worth of, or maybe it's longer, because I think Urza's son is an adult at this point. So 20 years worth of military buildup just starts slagging each other. And Urza remarks, so much work for so little result. And so yeah, the battle goes on, and Urza eventually finds out that Mishra has been corrupted by Phyrexia and black mana, and his brother's basically dead, and he's become a completed living machine. So Urza just kind of falls into a state of complete despair, and he's given a device called the Golgothian Silex. The Silex is like a big bowl, and Urza's told to fill it with memories of the land. Now, the Silex is always very enigmatic to me, because I don't understand what it was supposed to do. Because it's what it actually does doesn't really seem to have much relation to what it sounds like it's supposed to do. It says used to wipe the world clean, to topple empires, to start again, and that's not really what it did. But anyway, so Urza fills it with memories of the land, and it destroys the entire continent and just blows up large portions of Dominaria. However, what the Silex Blast also does is it finally unites both Power Stones within Urza, and he becomes a Planeswalker. It activates his spark. Urza is also the strongest Planeswalker because he has the Power Stones within him, which make him stronger. That's kind of hard to explain, but Urza is generally regarded as being the strongest being in the multiverse, other than Yawgmoth. Although Yawgmoth is not actually a Planeswalker. Yawgmoth can't teleport plane to plane. He's dependent upon portals. But anyway, so it does that. It also causes an ice age, which kills off much of the planet's population. And it creates a barrier of sorts around Dominaria and a bunch of other planes that prevents planeswalkers or portals from reaching them. So it keeps Urza away because he planeswalks away and he can't get back for a couple thousand years. It also prevents Phyrexia from sending anyone there as well. So Urza remarks to his apprentice before he leaves to tell his wife, remember me as the man I tried to be, not the man I was. And what was the man Urza tried to be? I don't really know, because during this whole thing, it's you never really. The reason I describe Urza as being autistic is you never really get a good idea of what the man like personally wants. He will. Urza is very. I think in my view. I'm sorry if I'm kind of struggling here. He's a hard man to describe. He very much has an idea of himself that's different from how he is, and his idea of himself feels very much like a contrivance. His attempt to kind of act like a normal person, because he doesn't really have emotions like normal people do. Whether that's his autism or he's a sociopath or something, I don't know. But he doesn't feel things. He feels that he should feel things. So, like, when his brother dies, he feels guilt over his role in it. He feels guilt when his father-in-law dies. He feels guilt over his wife and how he wasn't there for her. But he doesn't really feel these things. He kind of tries to read what he should be, what a normal person would be feeling in that situation, and impose that onto himself, and to try to act like how a normal person would act. I know that's kind of hard to explain, but particularly later on, Urza eventually kind of realizes that the majority of his life was a lie, and that he was just trying to make himself think that he was a better man than he was. That all along he kind of just didn't give a shit about other people. It's difficult to explain. I recommend if you can pick up the Urza saga, that is the Brothers' War, Time Streams, and Planeswalker, and Bloodlines to a certain extent, although it's much less about Urza. Also, the Invasion cycle deals with him a fair amount. But yeah, so in the aftermath of the destruction of his continent, Urza is banished from Dominaria because he created this kind of shard. Now, I guess a note on Planeswalkers. What is a Planeswalker? So the multiverse in Magic the Gathering is divided up into an infinite number of planes. The planes, it's not entirely clear if they're like planets or if they're kind of like flat discs kind of floating in the aether and nothingness. My view is they're like discs, so there's just a bunch of planes that range in size from like a house to an island to a continent. Almost all of them are much, much smaller than Earth. And there's a limitless number of them, and they have no way to contact one another. All of them believe more or less that they're the only plane of existence. Now, 1 in a million sentient beings are born with a spark, the Planeswalker spark. And it activates normally upon their death or in the time of great stress, and they become a Planeswalker. Planeswalkers are beings of pure energy who cannot die in any conventional way. They're completely immortal, they possess godlike powers, and they can move between planes at will, and often pull stuff between planes. A lot of Planeswalkers wind up becoming gods of the respective communities. I can't pronounce her name, but the Elven Planewalker winds up becoming basically the god of the elves, and they worship her. And a lot of them will make kingdoms for themselves, or even conquer entire planes for themselves. Urza is probably the strongest Planeswalker, other than maybe Karn, to ever live, and his abilities are nearly limitless. He can cast the spells with the power of thousands of mages. His body can get completely destroyed and regenerate. He can change his appearance and size and shape at will. And of course he can teleport between the different planes. Urza is, for all intents and purposes, a god. However, he doesn't really care that much about his powers. They're kind of an incidental thing. Because all Urza really wanted was just to kind of be autistic and study artifacts. He likes them because it makes his mind a lot stronger than it was, so he can study artifacts more. And being immortal means he can study artifacts for longer than his human body would have allowed him to. But to a certain extent, there's always a disconnect between him and who he is. And at the same time, though, it also makes him even more remote from humanity, because he no longer has basic needs like sleeping, eating, and dying. So he just kind of, as the series goes on, he just gets more and more and more divorced from humanity, especially once we get into kind of the Legacy saga, where he's trying to make his plan that goes on for like 5,000 years to cure the common cold and destroy Yawgmoth. He really just loses all track of reality. And once again, what makes Urza such a good character is this is all stuff that's referred to in universe. People like Rain hates Urza. She's like, he's a sociopath. He's a horrible person. He has no ability to feel normal human emotions. You can't trust him. A lot of people really hate him. A lot of people respect him, but a lot of people like just really are unnerved by him. Most of the other planeswalkers hate him because they think he's a weirdo. They think he like is really difficult to get along with, and they have no idea like what he's going to do next. Because most of the planeswalkers, even if they have to take a certain detachment just because of their lifespan, they still keep most of their human emotions, or well, whatever they were beforehand, because some planeswalkers are dragons, some are goblins, some are elves, etc. But they try to keep their mortal emotions, and Urza didn't have mortal emotions to begin with, so becoming a god means he's even more abstract. Like when he's trying to get the coalition together to invade Phyrexia, most of the planeswalkers basically tell him to fuck off until he's able to convince them that this is really the only way that they're going to be able to defeat Yawgmoth. So, yeah, that's kind of the first part of it. Urza's kind of background, his childhood, kind of the basics of his character, and what will guide Urza for the remainder of the Magic the Gathering series, and I'll do a second video that covers the rest of it, is Urza's belief that he's trying to atone for the guilt of all the wrongs he did during the Brothers' War. His attempts to atone for that and to make amends for it, and also the ways, his attempt to make amends for and avenge his brother's death. Because he correctly sees Phyrexia as being the one who killed his brother and not him, despite the fact he was going to kill his brother. But he, I think to a certain extent, takes all of the negative aspects about himself, all of the negative deeds he did, and kind of foists all of the guilt onto Yawgmoth and Phyrexia. Because they're a very easy target, because Yawgmoth is Satan. He's literally like a giant cloud of evil that can devour worlds. So it's very easy for us to just go, look, it wasn't me, I kind of screwed up, but Yawgmoth and the Phyrexians, and they want to consume the multiverse. I didn't do anything, it was them. And I think to a certain extent, Urza kind of, his obsession with destroying Phyrexia is in part his obsession with offloading his guilt and the responsibility for his actions off onto an external enemy, and then destroying it as kind of the means of redeeming himself. He's offloading his sins, and then he's going to blow them up. But I think as we'll eventually see once we get to the end of this in Apocalypse, Urza kind of has a revelation that everything he's done was kind of him fulfilling what he thought were his obligations. And that ultimately he didn't really give a shit about his brother. He didn't really care about his wife. He didn't really care about Dominaria or justice or any of the things he thought he did. All of that was just kind of an act. All of that was just kind of him trying to be something he wasn't and kind of deluding himself. And he kind of starts to realize, like, why was I even deluding myself this whole time? Why would I do that? So that's kind of part one of Urza Planeswalker. I hope that makes sense. I'm sorry if this was kind of all over the place, but there's a lot of ground to cover. It's a very complicated character. Keep in mind, this is covering like 12 books or something, and like a bunch of series and a bunch of retcons and redos. So that is part one.